All right. So this document is here if you wanted a little bit more support with the Nelson Mandela readings that are in today's lesson. So I'm actually going to read through the document here if you are somebody who's like, ugh, I really don't want to read it myself, but I'd love to hear it. So I'm going to start reading up here and I will be stopping to kind of explain some things as well. So, Nelson Mandela was born on July 18th, 1918, into a royal family in a South African village where his father served as chief. Nelson Mandela was the first in his family to receive a formal education. In 1939, Mandela entered the elite, which means like really high quality or a good place, University of Fort Hare, the only Western style, meaning like European higher learning institute for South African blacks at the time. It was the only university that black people in South Africa could go to. The following year, he and several other students were sent home for participating in a boycott, meaning like we're not gonna do this if you don't make things better for us, against the university policies. Later, he studied law at the University of Witwatersrand, where he became involved in the movement against racial discrimination, meaning treating people differently based on their race, their color, and created relationships with Black and white activists. An activist is like a person who's fighting for rights. In 1944, Mandela joined the African National Congress and worked to establish its youth league. Nelson Mandela's commitment to politics and the ANC grew stronger in 1948 when the mostly white political party won more power and introduced a formal system of racial classification and segregation, meaning like to separate or divide, called apartheid, which you already read about. Apartheid, which was this policy that separated people and it restricted non-whites' basic rights and barred them from the government. This is basically saying that in 1948, when this white political party, they were called the National Party, when they won more power, they're like, you know what? We're going to make things even worse. We're going to say, you can't go here. We can do all this. You can, like, just like the photos that you saw. You saw the people that white people could go to places where black people couldn't go. They had different beaches. They had all these different things that divided them. Apartheid is a very specific term that stands for segregation in South Africa between the white and the non-white population. So, the following year, the ANC began boycotts, strikes, civil disobedience, and other nonviolent methods in an attempt to gain more rights for Black South Africans. Mandela helped lead the ANC's 1952 campaign for the defiance of unjust laws, traveling across the country to organize protests against discriminatory policies, and promoted the manifesto known as the Freedom Charter. A manifesto is like a writing which you strongly express your opinions. Remember the Communist Manifesto, where they're like, we believe in this? Same thing, just not for communism. On December 5th, 1956, Mandela and 155 other activists were arrested and went on trial for treason. All the defendants were proven not guilty in 1961, but in the meantime, tensions within the ANC escalated. The next year, meaning they increased. The next year, police opened fire on peaceful black protesters in the township of Sharpeville, killing 69 people. So these people were peacefully protesting, and the white government was like, "No, you can't do that," and they killed them. Panic, anger, and riots swept the country in the massacre's aftermath. The apartheid government banned the ANC. So they said, you can't even organize anymore. So we're taking away more political rights. So Mandela's feeling awful about this. So although Mandela and his group tried nonviolent methods, they, unlike Gandhi, believed that violence sometimes had to be used to make changes. So they're not as civilly disobedient anymore because they were like, this isn't working. So therefore, in 1961, Nelson Mandela co-founded and became the first leader of, I really can't pronounce this, Mkhonto we Sizwe, I don't know, Spirit of the Nation, also known as MK. We'll go with that. A new armed group in the ANC. In January 1962, Mandela secretly left South Africa to undergo military training and to get support from African countries for the armed struggle. He was arrested in August and charged with leaving the country illegally and encouraging the strike. He was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in prison. This is the first time he goes to prison. We're going to come back to that again later. So then, in 1963, a secret hideout he once used was raided by police, and he was arrested for treason. In 1964, Mandela was sentenced to prison for life, meaning he's probably never going to get out. When he was sentenced to prison for life, he said this: "I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve. But if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." It's basically saying, you know what, I will go to prison and I will literally stay here for the rest of my life just to show you how serious I am about this, how selfless he was about the cause of fighting for equality in South Africa. So Nelson Mandela spent the first 18 of his 27 years in jail at the brutal Robben Island prison, where he was confined to a small cell without a bed or plumbing, meaning no toilet, and forced to do hard labor, hard work. As a Black political prisoner, he received less food and fewer privileges than other prisoners. So even in prison, he's treated less. He was only allowed to see his wife, Winnie Mandela, once every 6 months. Mandela and his fellow prisoners were routinely subjected to inhumane punishments, meaning the worst kind of punishments, for even the smallest things, the smallest offenses. There were also reports of guards burying inmates in the ground up to their necks and urinating on them, meaning peeing on them. Just like awful. However, while in confinement, meaning while he was in prison, Mandela earned a Bachelor of Law degree from the University of London and served as a mentor to his fellow prisoners, encouraging them to seek better treatment through nonviolent resistance. So even while in prison, he was still fighting for rights. He also smuggled out political statements, meaning he snuck out political statements and a draft of his autobiography. That means a book that he wrote about himself called Long Walk to Freedom, which was published 5 years after his release. Despite his imprisonment, Mandela remained the symbolic leader of the anti-apartheid movement. In 1980, a Free Nelson Mandela campaign was made, and it led to increased calls for equality in South Africa. Eventually, the government offered Mandela his freedom in exchange for various political compromises, meaning agreements. But he said, you know what? No, and he rejected all deals. Instead, in 1988, he was placed under house arrest. The following year, however, newly elected President F.W. de Klerk, who was white, called for a non-racist South Africa. On February 11, 1990, he ordered Mandela's release from prison. So he finally gets out of prison after being in there for, I think it was 27 years. Not for life. After getting his freedom, Nelson Mandela and the ANC negotiated with the South African government for an end to apartheid. So getting rid of this legal segregation and the creation of a multiracial, meaning all races, government. In 1993, President F.W. de Klerk announced that South Africa would have its first all-race election in 1994. Following this announcement, Mandela and President F.W. de Klerk won the Nobel Peace Prize. On April 26, 1994, more than 22 million South Africans turned out to cast ballots in the country's first multiracial parliamentary elections in history. An overwhelming majority chose the ANC to lead the country, and on May 10, 1994, Mandela became the first Black president of South Africa, truly bringing an end to apartheid. This is huge, this paragraph here. It's basically saying, in 1994, the country of South Africa, which is in Africa, elected its first Black president. That is how strong the racist laws were there, that it wasn't until 1994 that they finally had somebody who looked like majority of them as their own president. Yes, the United States didn't get its first Black president until, 2008, but we did have African Americans or people of color in our government before that who were maybe senators or congresspeople. It just goes to show how strong apartheid was and how getting rid of it really changed things for the better in South Africa. Even though some people say ending apartheid hasn't made everything magically better in South Africa. Look, it's only been less than 30 years. However, it's better than it was. It's better than literally feeling like you were in a cage and you couldn't go certain places. So, as President Mandela established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to investigate human rights and political violations committed by both supporters and opponents of apartheid between 1960 and 1994. He also introduced many social and economic programs meant to improve the living standards of South Africa's Black population. In 1996, Mandela oversaw the creation of a new South African constitution, which prohibited discrimination against minorities, including whites. Improving race relations and building a new international image of a united South Africa were important to President Mandela. He formed a multiracial government of national unity and proclaimed the country a rainbow nation at peace with itself and the world.